kind of a challenge I would have to anybody who watches the Is Genesis History movie. When one side presents their argument, it sounds compelling until somebody comes and cross-examines them.
Hello again, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Is Genesis History Science? On October 16, 2015, Compass Cinema interviewed Dr. Kurt Wise, PhD in paleontology from Harvard University, with Dr. Del Tackett at Pocket Wilderness in Dayton, Tennessee. Del starts out this segment by telling us how Kurt Wise took him from place to place, showing him evidence of fossil forests, explaining the rapid formation of coal. It should be noted, however, that nowhere in this segment is there any mention of rapid formation of coal. They end up at the entrance of an old abandoned coal mine. Let's join them, shall we?
This is leftover remains of the Dayton Coal and Iron Company, built around 100 to 110 years ago.
But what's amazing is, if you didn't know that history, and if you looked at these rocks, you would think they were very ancient. In fact, if we were in Greece, you might think they were thousands of years old.
Well, lucky for us, we do know its history. Real history, that would be. We know that it was an entrance to a mine owned and operated by the Dayton Coal and Iron Company. It is well documented that the Dayton Coal and Iron Company began operations in 1882, so this structure cannot be older than that. What makes me think there's some false equivocation in our near future?
It's hard to tell from just looking at the structure itself.
Yes, it is. That's why we use additional means to establish the age of something. I'm guessing that what you're trying to do here is plant the relatively simple idea that things that look old may not be old in the minds of your credulous viewers, who will not take the next step and inquire if other dating methods are in use.
Well, Kurt, then I need for you to do something for me, because I know that the conventional paradigm looks back in Earth history and it's a straight line. A lot of uniform processes and so forth. But the Genesis history is telling us that it's not that uniform.
Whoa, hold on there. The premise of this entire movie is to try and establish that Genesis is history. And the claim you just made is based on Genesis being history. That is a classic example of circular reasoning.
Yep, that's a good point. In 2 Peter 3, it talks about people in the latter days saying, "Where is the promise of his coming? For all things continue as they were from the beginning of the creation." That concept, that what you see in the present, that's what's happening right now, what's happening in the creek down below, what's happening in every place on Earth is the way it's always been. It's always been for all of Earth history. So the passage goes on to say, "For this they are willingly ignorant." They are not just ignorant of these truths, they are purposely rejecting these truths. It lists the creation and the flood. These are apparently events, according to the Bible, that aren't like the present. And the neat thing is, that's what we see here. You've got events, even here, like those rocks right up there. That cliff isn't actually in place. That cliff belongs about 1,000 feet up. It slid down to its current location. That's a pretty big boulder.
That's huge. It's massive.
Now, what kind of process in the present slides blocks that big down? This thing continues for a mile.
Okay, first, stating that these are truths does not automatically cause them to become truths. I remind you that it is your goal, not your starting point, to establish that the Bible represents history. As for your large rock, I fail to see how that is related to the preceding claims. Loose sediment may have been eroded from beneath a boulder, or perhaps it had fractured off of an even larger rock. Things like that happened in the past. things like that happen in the present.
But inside those rocks are yet further evidence of an event before that's even bigger, even more unlike the present. And then inside those rocks are also fossils of a time period that's very different from the present. So according to the claims of Scripture, and according to my own experience, you can't use the present to judge the past, to understand the past.
You indicate that there is evidence inside the rocks, yet you fail to disclose exactly what that evidence is or what it indicates. You put forth the existence of fossils as evidence. We'll ignore for now your use of the word further. That things were different in the past. I assume that, since your intended audience has heard the term fossil before, they'll accept without question the assertion that things were different. No doubt, based on that, you expect them to broaden the scope of things were different to include your impossibly compressed time frames for geologic and evolutionary events. Sadly, you're probably making a safe bet there.
But if you go all the way back to the beginning, you realize that the Bible lays out what I would call epochs of Earth history.
Major periods of time.
Just different things happening during each of these epochs. But if you lived in any one of the other epochs, you would never understand the previous epoch because it's so different. The first one is the creation itself. In 6 days, God created the entire universe. He created the planets and the stars, and he stretched out the universe with his outstretched arm. That's obviously not happening today. He's not creating planets. In fact, at the end of that passage, he says he ended his creation work.
Maybe if I say it in a different way. You're stating that events occurred based on the Bible as your authoritative source. I'd like to once again remind you that your implied goal in making the Is Genesis History movie is to hopefully demonstrate that the Bible, and in particular Genesis, is an authoritative source. Until that is proven, using it as an authoritative source is disingenuous.
Then we move on into what I call the Edenian epoch, the period of time when Adam and Eve are in the Garden of Eden. And it's very different from the present. We get the impression from that passage, for example, that Adam and Eve, if they had not sinned, would have lived forever. Well, that's weird. It's hard to even conceive of human beings living forever. So it's a different world, wildly different. How long it lasts, we don't know, but suddenly terminated with Adam and Eve eating of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and God cursing the creation. He changed the rules in the universe. Now, no longer is the sun going to be able to burn forever. No longer are we going to be able to live forever.
Finally, we get to talk about a little science. Alright, unfortunately, the scientific evidence shows that Adam and Eve could not have existed. Genetic data shows no evidence of any human bottleneck as small as 2 people. There are just too many different kinds of genes around for that to be the case. There were several bottlenecks that occurred in our species, but the smallest one is a bottleneck of roughly 10,000 to 15,000 individuals between 50,000 and 100,000 years ago. That's as small a population as our ancestors ever had. This is not the kind of information that Dell and his cohorts would like to hear. Obviously, if Adam and Eve never existed, original sin never existed. And if original sin never existed, almost the entire framework upon which this religion is constructed disappears.
So it's hard for us to even imagine what that would be like because we only see the laws that are present.
So you're saying that because we can only see the laws of nature in the present, they must have been different in the past. Classic non sequitur. To date, no creationist, or anyone else, has provided any evidence for this different set of rules you're requiring in your model.
And we wouldn't have come to that conclusion if we didn't have the Word of God. And that's what I think the Word of God has been given to us for.
And there we have it. An unsolicited admission that the conclusions in this segment are entirely based on and originate with claims made in the Bible. If you recall, the mission inherent in this movie is to prove that the Bible accurately depicts a series of historical accounts. Kurt seems to be saying that he's abandoned that mission altogether and, instead, will use the as yet unproven historicity of the Bible as evidence in favor of a batch of other hypotheses.
So we slide into the third epoch of time, what I call the Antiluvian epoch, the period before the flood and after the fall of man. It's a world that's different than the present. It's got the same natural laws going on, but it's a different set of critters, a different set of plants. It's a little bit warmer Earth. The continents are in different positions from what they are now. It looks significantly different.
Chief? Kurt, there's no evidence whatsoever for a global flood. In fact, there's quite a bit of evidence against. As mentioned in a previous episode, there were thriving cultures that went about their daily lives and apparently took no notice of any potential global extinction-level events during the time period you specify. That being the case, any mention of conditions before or after make no sense whatsoever.
And that's what we see in Peter, where it talks about that world being destroyed. So the flood was not just soaking everything. This is radical change, wasn't it?
Yeah. If we're right about what we've understood, so far, we've got continents moving, smashing together, creating mountains. Mountains are rising to tens of thousands of feet. You've got water washing across entire continents. We're ripping tens of thousands of feet of sediment off of the old continents and then depositing thousands of feet of sediment on top of them again. We're looking at earthquakes of astonishing power.
Or it could have been plate tectonics. Of course, when I say could have been, I really mean was. All the major mountain ranges have been studied in detail. The plate movements that caused them have been mapped, and their histories have been worked out for millions of years in the past. The problem of mountain formation has been solved, and a flood had no part in the solution. Secondly, the catastrophic formation of mountains and subsequent return of the sea into its basin would have released tremendous amounts of heat and mechanical energy, enough to boil the oceans and metamorphose the minerals in those mountains. No trace of such a catastrophe exists. Formation of mountains during the flood also does not explain why different mountains are different ages. The Appalachians, for example, are much older than the Rockies, as one can immediately see just from how the two ranges are differently eroded.
So, this changed then from what you call the Antiluvian epoch, now into the post-flood.
Basically, the Earth has got to recover from a global flood. Everything has to recover. The atmosphere has to recover, the geology, the rocks have to recover. Plants and animals have to spread across the Earth. You've got lots of water. You've got humongous earthquakes. You've got humongous volcanoes. And more or less that period of recovery is a slow decrease in the intensity and frequency of those things.
Would it be in that period that we would see the Ice Age, for example?
Yes. Ironically, the Ice Age turns out to be, in our modeling, a consequence of the heating of the water during the flood. Water is evaporating off the oceans. That cools the oceans. The water is then moving over the continents and dropping enormous volumes of water. Now, in certain places, the oceans are going to cool enough that the rain is going to come down as snow, but coming down so rapidly and without break that it can't melt, and it accumulates to thick sequences of ice. And then, when the oceans have cooled enough that the rain generation system stopped, Then those glaciers collapsed under their own weight, melted back to the current position, and they're continuing to melt. This thing, global warming, the Earth is still recovering from the flood.
Alright, the hypothesis you just heard from Kurt is beyond silly. Adding heat to a system makes it hotter. The falling moisture would have been hot rain, not snow. Kurt invokes evaporation as a cooling method. He's forgotten that all the heat lost to evaporation returns when the water condenses again, and that more latent heat is then released in the freezing. An ice age cannot fit into his timescale. For a continent-scale glacier to form, advance enough to change the landscape, and retreat takes centuries or more, not a decade.
So that was really a fairly tumultuous era right then. But then you have one final epoch.
So, in the modern epoch, you can study present processes and understand things fairly readily back to within a couple of centuries of the flood.
And so that would lead one to think that these processes, if you take them all the way back...
Precisely. See, I didn't say yeah that time. You take the present processes and extend them into the past, and that's what 2 Peter says. All things continue as they were from the beginning of the creation. So they take the current rates. If you did this much work in a short amount of time, how much time would it take to do all of it? It would take a long time to do what happened very quickly in the flood. And so that's the error people make. It's reasonable. Take the present and extend it into the past. Not unreasonable. So you need to go to the Bible to find out the necessary information to reconstruct it. And looking at it the other way, if you start from the Bible, you only get the beginning of the story. God has given us the ability to read the rocks and fill in the rest of the story we need to fully understand the flood. We start with the Bible, but then we go to the rocks. Speak to the rocks, and they shall tell what happened in the past.
Kurt, you mentioned the rocks before, and gave no information whatsoever about how the rocks confirm your hypotheses. Which, to be fair, are not really your hypotheses, are they? They're the same fairy tales the creationists have been spewing for years. Nice work pretending that they were all your ideas, though. If I heard your babble correctly, you seem to state that present-day processes would have been in effect starting a few hundred years after the alleged flood. If you've listened to the pug like a good creationist, you now understand that all of the geologic activity you described could not have occurred in just those few hundred years. In your closing, I see that once again, instead of trying to support the historicity of Genesis, you decided to skip that little step and use Genesis as the basis for all your hypotheses. Isn't it wonderful how if you start with a conclusion, it's really easy to create a fanciful fairy tale of reality, as you've done. Bravo! Anyway, that about wraps it up for this episode. If you haven't already done so, please subscribe to both the Pelagia and Sci-Strike channels so you don't miss any of the upcoming episodes. Thanks for joining me. See you next time.